She was 15, pregnant, and terrified. When she finally threatened to speak his name, he dragged her to the barn and shot her in the face. Then he set her body on fire, believing the flames would silence the truth forever. This isn't some backwoods urban legend or twisted campfire tale. This happened in the frost-bitten hills of Lawrence County, Ohio, where the old order Amish live without electricity, modern distractions, or accountability. He was man revered for his spiritual leadership, feared for his unyielding discipline, and obeyed without question. But behind the hand-carved crosses and oil lamp sermons, he was hiding something dark, something evil, a secret buried deep in haylofts, holy texts, and hushed prayers. The victim? His own daughter. A girl born into a world where silence was demanded, pain was normalized, and obedience meant survival. But she was different. And when she finally found the courage to speak, her truth became the spark that exposed the devil hiding in plain sight. In the heart of Lawrence County's Amish countryside, behind handmade quilts and candlelit sermons, a monstrous secret was growing, and when it came to light, it shattered a sacred community. Before we uncover the twisted truth behind this horrific crime, like this video and subscribe for more haunting tales where innocence meets unspeakable evil. In the quiet, frost-kissed countryside of Lawrence County, Ohio, far from highways and cell towers, stood the weather-worn homestead of Bishop Eliam Burrell, a man once revered, even feared, within the cloistered Old Order Amish community. With salt and pepper hair that curled beneath his wide-brimmed hat and eyes that burned with unspeakable knowledge, Eliam was the kind of man you obeyed, even when you didn't understand why. To the outside world, he was a shepherd of souls. But inside his home, behind oil lamps and hand-carved crosses, he was something else entirely. Something monstrous. Eliam was 56 years old, a patriarch in every sense of the word. He walked with a wooden cane carved from hickory and quoted scripture like it was stitched into his bones. People called him God's voice with a wooden cane, and they meant it, not with sarcasm or irony, but fear. In their world, Eliam didn't just preach about God. He was the law, the judge, the executioner of spiritual and domestic order. No one questioned him. No one dared. He had 8 children, each one raised in the rigid, unbending customs passed down through generations. The girls wore starched bonnets and long dresses. The boys rose before dawn and worked their hands raw. There were no phones, no internet, no interruptions from the outside world. Just devotion, obedience, and silence. And yet, within that brood of children, one stood out. Mahaliah Ray Burrell. She was his 4th child. 15 years old. Slender and quiet, with piercing green eyes that seemed too knowing for her age. Her voice was soft, her posture timid, but there was something about her that lingered in the air like unshed rain. The community called her different, but not in a way they could explain. It wasn't the way she acted. It was the way she was treated. She wore fresh calico when her sisters were still patching up torn sleeves. She had soft leather shoes while her siblings walked on soles worn thin. Her chores were light, and always under supervision. She never mucked stalls. She never carried water. And she never, ever churned butter unless someone was watching. She moved through that house like someone kept behind glass. Handled, not held. Some called it favoritism. Others whispered that maybe Eliam was protecting her. But those who saw her flinch when he entered a room, those who noticed how her smile never quite reached her eyes, they knew something else was wrong. They just didn't say it out loud. Because in that community, obedience wasn't just expected, it was survival. Mahaliah had been under Eliam's shadow her entire life. But the darkness truly fell when she turned 11. That's when the grooming began. Quiet, subtle, insidious. It started with praise during family prayers, extra time in the prayer room, late-night visits under the guise of spiritual discipline. Her mother, Eloise, noticed. She saw the shifts in behavior, the way Mahaliah grew quieter, more withdrawn. She saw her daughter crying in the garden for no reason, shaking when Eliam touched her shoulder. Eloise knew. But what could she do? She was a woman raised to obey, to submit. Her husband was the bishop, and in the Amish world, a husband was second only to God. Speaking against him meant shaming the family. Speaking truth meant tearing the whole house down. So she said nothing. She became a ghost in her own home, watching, mourning, and pretending not to know. The Amish enclave they lived in was small, isolated, suspicious of outsiders. And within its boundaries, patriarchs ruled with iron hands wrapped in scripture. Girls married young. Wives didn't speak unless spoken to. Secrets festered in silence, passed through glances and prayers. If something was wrong, it was dealt with by the bishop behind closed doors, and if the bishop was the problem, there was nowhere to turn. Because Eliam was the bishop. He was the one people confessed to, the one they turned to in times of crisis, the one who decided whether someone was punished or forgiven. And in that holy prison, Mahaliah Ray was both prisoner and offering. She kept her head down. She learned to stay quiet. She learned how to smile just enough, nod at the right moments, and hold her tears until she was alone. But the pain was etched into her bones, and it grew heavier each year until the weight of it began to crack the silence. Something was building in that house. You could feel it in the air, like thunder before a storm. The walls, the floors, the crosses carved by hand, none of it could hide the truth for long. Because secrets, no matter how deeply buried, always find a way to scream. And when this one did, it shattered everything. Then came Marcellus Cello Ford, a 31-year-old black ex-convict trying to rebuild his life as a feed delivery man. Out of place in the white, insular community, Cello moved quietly. He smiled, tipped his cap, and kept to himself. But he noticed things. Mahaliah's shrinking posture, the way she flinched at her father's footsteps, the dull bruise that shadowed her collarbone in early summer. Cello had lived through hell. Beaten in group homes, shuffled through juvie, locked up at 21 for a charge he didn't bother denying. He'd spent years behind concrete and steel, and by the time he got out, all he wanted was peace. He wasn't looking to be a hero. He wasn't trying to get involved. But he'd learned how to spot the signs. He'd seen that same haunted look in the mirror more times than he could count. He recognized trauma. He recognized terror. And he couldn't ignore it. The Amish didn't say much to Cello, not really. They were polite in passing, stiff and cautious. Some wouldn't make eye contact. Others called him boy, with a clipped smile, like they were still stuck in a century long gone. He knew his place out there. Deliver the grain, load the hay, nod, leave. They didn't trust outsiders, and they damn sure didn't trust someone like him. But he wasn't there for their approval. He was there for the paycheck and the fresh air. That was it. Still, Cello's eyes worked. And what he saw in that Burrell household started to weigh on him. Mahaliah always kept her head down when he came around. She'd disappear into the back if he spoke too loud, like the sound itself might hurt her. Once, he saw her walking barefoot in the field with blood on her heel, limping slightly. No one helped her. No one even looked. And then came that morning in August. Hot, thick air and sweat already collecting at the base of his neck as he hauled feed to the barn. The door was cracked open, just a sliver, and through it, he saw Eliam standing over Mahaliah. Her hands were folded, her head down, but apparently not far enough. Without warning, Eliam struck her across the face with the back of his hand. Hard. Her body folded inward like she'd been hit 1,000 times before. She didn't even cry out. Cello froze. The bag of feed in his hands felt suddenly weightless. For a second, he considered barging in, but he didn't. Not yet. He just stood there, jaw tight, and watched as Eliam stormed off, leaving Mahaliah crumpled by the hay bales, trying not to sob. That moment stuck to him like sweat. From that day forward, something shifted. Cello started asking quiet questions. Not direct ones, nothing stupid. Just little comments to the locals. Old farmers he'd helped fix fences with. A gas station clerk he'd shared coffee with. His buddy Mike, a sheriff's deputy from town who used to lift weights with him before the prison stint. You ever hear anything weird out by the Amish homesteads? He asked once, offhand, like he was just making conversation. Bishop Burrell's place? Ever get calls out there? The answers came the same way every time. Shrugs. Frowns. Silence. One man mumbled, "Ain't our business." Another said, You don't poke around them people. Even Mike, the deputy, got cagey. "We've been out there once," he said. "Didn't see anything. Nobody talked. Hell, I felt like I was trespassing on God's lawn." The community protected Eliam like he was the Ark of the Covenant. His name wasn't just respected, it was feared. People didn't just look up to him. They depended on him. He was the one who settled disputes, blessed marriages, oversaw funerals. If he went down, the whole spiritual spine of the enclave collapsed. No one wanted that. Not for a girl. Not even a daughter. So when the investigators came, yes, they did come, they left just as fast. A couple of uniformed men from the sheriff's office made the hour-long drive out to the homestead, asked some questions, drank some lemonade, and got vague, smiling answers in return. No one cried for help. No one told the truth. Mahalaya herself wouldn't even meet their eyes. And just like that, they packed up their notebooks and went back to town. Officially, there was nothing to report. Unofficially, it was written all over their faces. They knew something was wrong. But without a voice, without a witness, without someone brave enough to shatter the holy illusion, there was nothing they could do. But Cello couldn't let it go. Something in him. Maybe guilt, maybe instinct, maybe that stubborn flame that prison couldn't put out, refused to let this girl disappear into silence. He kept watching, kept asking, kept showing up, because deep down he knew the storm wasn't just coming. It was already here. Everything changed on a bitter November dawn. The frost was thick on the fields, and Mahalaya moved slow, too slow, dragging a wooden pail across the pasture to feed the cows. Her hands trembled with every step. She leaned against the fence post, panting, pale as death. Then, without warning, she dropped to her knees and collapsed into the cold, mud-caked earth. The screams came from her little sister. Then the clatter of hooves and panicked voices. Someone ran to fetch the midwife. A stout woman named Sister Willa who had delivered most of the community's children by lantern light. She arrived out of breath, clutching her bag, expecting fever or infection. What she found was something else entirely. When she lifted Mahalaya's dress and pressed her fingers to the girl's swollen abdomen, she went pale. No words. Just a slow step back and a shaking of her head. The bishop's daughter was pregnant, 3 months at least. The news hit the enclave like a lightning strike. The council convened that very night. 5 elders, all patriarchs in their own right, gathering by candlelight beneath Eliam's roof. They came wearing dark coats and tighter expressions. The mood was grave, the shame thick and buzzing like flies in a slaughterhouse. Eliam, towering in the room, unleashed a performance worthy of scripture. He slammed his palm against the wooden table, cursed into his beard, and demanded answers. "Who touched my child?" he roared. "Who defiled the blood of this house?" He wept. He prayed aloud. He clutched his Bible like a sword. To the men around him, it was righteous fury. A father betrayed. But to Mahalaya, watching from the edge of the room with a face drained of color, it was theater. Nothing more. Because she knew the truth. She knew the monster in the bishop's robe. And she knew her silence was the only thing keeping her alive. So she said nothing. No name. No accusation. Just tears. Her green eyes stared at the floor, vacant, lost. And later that night, when the candles were snuffed and the elders went home in solemn silence, Eliam came to her room. He didn't hit her. He didn't scream. He knelt beside her bed and whispered, calm as ice, "Speak my name, and your body will feed the pigs before sunrise." From that moment on, Mahalaya moved like a ghost. Her footsteps became quieter, her presence dimmer. But her belly grew. There was no hiding it now. Her siblings began to whisper behind doors. The older ones asked questions. The younger ones watched her with wide, confused eyes. And then, one day, the midwife was gone. No goodbyes. No explanation. Just gone. Word spread she had moved north to Pennsylvania to stay with distant cousins. But some said she'd left in fear. Others said she was paid to disappear. Eliam's sermons turned strange. Gone were the gentle parables, the quiet meditations. In their place came fury, fire and damnation. His voice would crack from the strain of shouting. His fist would slam the pulpit. One Sunday, he screamed that God tested the righteous through fire, blood, and sacrifice. Another, he warned that temptation walks among us, even under our own roofs. The women sat stiff in the pews, heads bowed. The men nodded along, stone-faced. And Mahalia sat in the back, her hands folded tightly over her stomach, trying not to tremble. Her mother, Eloise, said nothing. Not once. But neighbors began to notice the way she cried in the corners of barns. How her eyes were always red, how her apron was always damp. She aged 10 years and a month. Her silence was the silence of women broken in half by faith and fear. And still, no one spoke up. Because to speak against the bishop was to speak against God. And in Lawrence County, God was Eliam Burrell. Then Mahalia vanished. For 3 days, her family told anyone who asked that she'd gone on a spiritual retreat, some made-up sabbatical to a farmhouse in the next county. Her mother, Eloise, trembled with every word she was forced to repeat. Her hand shook while folding bread dough. Her eyes darted to the ground when asked about her daughter. But Marcellus Cello Ford wasn't buying it. He hadn't seen Mahalia in the fields. Her goats were unfed. Her prayer shawl still hung by the door, unmoved. The rhythm of her chores had stopped, like a bird's song suddenly gone silent. And Cello, with his gut tuned by a lifetime of pain, knew something was terribly wrong. On the 4th morning, the sky turned black. Flames leapt from the Burrell barn like the devil himself had risen through the floorboards. Thick smoke twisted into the air, heavy with the scent of burning timber and something else, something foul. Neighbors ran from all directions, boots pounding frozen earth, buckets in hand. Cello was among the first to reach the fire, but Eliam was already there. Standing at the doorway, soot on his face, ash in his beard, arms stretched wide like a prophet awaiting rapture. "It's too late," he said, voice low and strange. "God's work is done." No one could make sense of his calm. The barn burned until it collapsed inward like a dying star. And then came the smell. When the fire finally surrendered to the cold and the smoke thinned to gray, someone found it. A false wall in the loft, blackened, still smoldering. Behind it, curled in on herself like a broken doll, was Mahalia. Her body was nearly unrecognizable. Charred flesh, twisted limbs, melted nightdress, but the truth lay beneath the ruin. The coroner's report was brief but damning. She'd been shot. Twice. Once in the chest. Once in the face. She had died long before the fire. Eliam had dragged her into the barn the night she threatened to tell. To name him. To finally say the words that would shatter his kingdom of silence. And in that moment, he chose annihilation. He poured kerosene over her body, stuffed a rag into a cracked oil lantern, lit a match. He believed fire would cleanse what he'd done. That flame would make the filth holy. But evil doesn't burn away. It lingers. It clings. And no amount of fire can silence the scream of truth. For weeks later, the horror deepened. The wind had started to shift, warmer now, brushing over the frozen ground like spring trying to forget what winter had done. But behind the outhouse at the Burrell homestead, something festered. A sour stench that clung to the wind like a warning. Flies buzzed in angry clouds over a discarded burlap feed sack, knotted tight and slumped like forgotten trash. When the deputies sliced it open, even the seasoned ones turned away. Inside lay the decomposing body of a newborn, small, stiff, and bloated in the spring heat. The infant had been wrapped with eerie care in Mahalia's favorite hand-stitched quilt, the one with the faded blue patchwork stars she used to sleep beneath as a little girl. And stabbed into the baby's chest, splitting soft flesh and bone, was a carved wooden cross, sharpened at one end, jammed straight through like some twisted sacrifice. It wasn't just murder. It was ritual. The baby hadn't even had the chance to cry. Forensic tests confirmed what some had already begun to suspect in whispers. The child belonged to Mahalia. But she hadn't been 3 months pregnant when she collapsed in the field, as the midwife once believed. No, she had carried the baby nearly to term. 8 months. Somehow, Hidden beneath layers of plain dresses, silence, and terror, she had shielded the truth. Shielded the life growing inside her until the final days. And the father of that child? Eliam Burrell. The community's silence didn't just crack, it shattered. The mask of humility, of order, of righteous obedience, fell away like ash from a burned page. State troopers rolled in. FBI vans groaned down gravel roads. Crime scene tape cut across barn beams and butter churns. And the elders, those who had once sat beside Eliam in prayer, now sat with their heads in trembling hands. Inside the Burrell home, investigators unearthed journals, not of Mahalaya's, but Eliam's. Sermons scrawled in the margins of hymnals. Pages streaked with something that looked like blood. References to cleansing the womb, binding temptation, and offering first fruits unto the Lord. It was no longer a question of guilt. It was a reckoning. Everything the community had buried, every sin beneath their quiet, candlelit lives was clawing its way to the surface. The nightmare hadn't begun with Mahalaya's death. It had been living in that house for years, behind every sermon, beneath every prayer, under every floorboard. Eliam was arrested at dawn. They found him kneeling in his prayer room, surrounded by the stench of sweat, blood, and madness. The walls were covered in scrawled scripture, some in King James English, others in frenzied, ancient tongues that even the linguists couldn't fully translate. A cracked Bible sat open beside him, soaked in something that might have been blood or ink or both. Eliam Burrell, once the towering spiritual figure of Lawrence County's Amish enclave, was on the floor, trying to rip out his own eyes. His fingernails were split. His face was torn with self-inflicted wounds. He wept, chanted, bled, and screamed, quoting from the Gospel of Matthew in a ragged voice, "If thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee." He was still whispering scripture when the agents pulled him up and cuffed his wrists behind his back. But what came next chilled even the most hardened interrogators. On the day of the trial, Eliam didn't deny a single thing. He called himself a prophet of the threshing floor, claimed Mahalaya had been chosen by the Lord to carry a new Messiah. He referred to her body as an altar sanctified by blood, and to the murdered infant as a covenant offering to cleanse the sins of man. His language was poetic, terrifying, and utterly delusional. The journals only reinforced the nightmare. They spoke of ritual sacrifice, celestial conception, and a holy lineage that began not with love or consent, but with domination, control, and blasphemous fantasy. He believed God had spoken directly to him, that his abuse and crimes were divine instruction. But the most damning blow came from someone no one expected to speak. Zafrina Polk, a former housemaid who had worked in the Burrell home for just under a year, stepped forward. A woman with trembling hands and eyes hardened by grief. She testified that she had seen Eliam enter Mahalaya's room late at night, again and again. That she had heard soft cries and the shifting of bedposts. Once, she said, she confronted him, and he cornered her in the kitchen, laid a shaking hand on her belly, and whispered a curse in Pennsylvania Dutch. Zafrina miscarried twice that year, and though no doctor could ever say why, she never forgot the way her body changed after that moment. Her testimony sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Eliam's defense tried to argue mental illness, a personality disorder, religious psychosis, but the psychiatrists were clear. While disturbed, he was competent. He knew right from wrong. He had planned, hidden, lied, manipulated. He'd built false walls, burned evidence, threatened silence, and ritualized his crimes. That wasn't madness. That was method. The jury didn't deliberate long. Eliam Burrell was found guilty on every charge: rape, incest, murder, desecration, conspiracy, abuse of a corpse. The list felt endless, a litany of horror. At sentencing, the judge, normally reserved, almost pastoral in tone, looked Eliam in the eye and said, "You defiled the very idea of God." 6 consecutive life sentences. No possibility of parole. He left the courthouse shackled and grinning, mumbling psalms to himself. a broken man who still believed he was holy. But behind him, a community lay in ruins, its faith cracked, its silence condemned, and its innocence buried beneath ash and bone. And Mahalaya? She never got to speak her truth, but the world would never forget her name. In the weeks that followed Eliam Burrell's conviction, the Amish community that once bowed their heads at his sermons turned their backs with trembling shame. He was excommunicated with the quiet violence only the devout can deliver, his name scrubbed from prayer lists, his family home abandoned, the pew he once preached from left empty, like a wound no one dared touch. No one spoke of the bishop, not in public, not in private, not even in whispers. Mahalaya, once buried hastily behind a barn in scorched soil, was reinterred in a modest public cemetery outside Ironton. Her new headstone read only her name, her birth and death dates, and a single etched word, beloved. Townspeople she had never met came to tend her grave. They brought sunflowers and carved angels, placed votive candles that flickered through the nights. She became a symbol, not of tragedy, but of revelation. Her siblings, all 8 of them, were quietly relocated to distant relatives. Some went to Pennsylvania, others to Indiana. A few simply vanished into the systems that had long turned a blind eye. But what happens when the one who wields the Bible also wields the belt? When the shepherd becomes the wolf? When the man called bishop turns predator? Who speaks for the voiceless then? So we ask you, do communities like this enable abuse through silence and submission? How can we protect the vulnerable when the abuser wears the mask of righteousness? Think about Mahalaya. Think about every child still trapped in homes where candles flicker, but secrets burn brighter. If this story haunted you like it did us, like this video and subscribe for more cases where we uncover the darkest truths hidden behind the brightest smiles.